My uncle tried to have me declared mentally incompetent for my inheritance, so I played along until the court date. When my grandmother died and left me her entire estate, worth $2.3 million, I knew Uncle Garrett would lose his mind. He'd been circling like a vulture for years, waiting for his payday. What he didn't expect was Grandma's final screw you from beyond the grave. The will reading was brutal. Garrett sat there, jaw clenched, as the lawyer read how I'd inherit everything on my 25th birthday, just 6 months away. The house, the investments, even Grandma's antique jewelry collection. Garrett got nothing except a vintage tea set and a note that said, "For all your fake concern over the years." His face went through about 17 different emotions before settling on rage. "This is ridiculous," he stammered to the lawyer. "Vivian's barely functional. She dropped out of law school, lives like a hermit, and can't even hold a job." The lawyer, Mr. Henderson, adjusted his glasses. "The will is ironclad, Mr. Walsh. Your mother was of sound mind when she drafted it." Garrett's wife, Cheryl, my step-aunt, who'd married him for his expected inheritance, looked like she might vomit. She'd already picked out new furniture for the lake house, planned renovations for the main estate, and researched European cruises they'd take with their money. I'd overheard her on the phone with interior designers just 2 weeks earlier, discussing a complete makeover that would cost more than most people make in a year. "There has to be something we can do," Cheryl whispered, gripping Garrett's arm so tight her knuckles went white. "Oh, there is," Garrett said, his voice cold. "Trust me." The thing about Garrett was that he'd always been a schemer. Even as kids, he'd find ways to manipulate situations to his advantage. When we were young, he'd convince other relatives that Grandma was showing favoritism toward me, hoping they'd pressure her to be fair and include him more in her will. He'd bring her gifts he couldn't afford, then complain loudly about his financial struggles, hoping she'd offer to help. But Grandma saw right through him. She'd told me stories about how he'd tried to convince her to invest in his various failed business ventures over the years. A restaurant that closed within 6 months. A real estate flip that lost money when the market crashed. A pyramid scheme involving essential oils that got him investigated by the state attorney general. "Your uncle's problem," Grandma had explained while we baked cookies the Christmas before she died, "is that he thinks everyone else is as stupid as he is. He's been trying to manipulate me for 30 years, and he still hasn't figured out that I see right through him." 2 weeks later, the legal papers arrived. Garrett was petitioning the court to have me declared mentally incompetent, claiming I was unstable and unfit to manage significant assets. His evidence? That I'd dropped out of law school after a nervous breakdown, lived alone with too many cats, I had too, exhibited erratic behavior patterns, and had been increasingly isolated and paranoid since my grandmother's death. The petition was thorough. He'd documented every time I'd canceled plans, every occasion I'd seemed distracted at family gatherings, every moment I'd appeared anything less than perfectly composed. He'd even gotten statements from neighbors claiming I talked to myself and kept strange hours. Mrs. Henderson from next door had signed an affidavit saying she'd seen me having animated conversations with invisible people in my backyard. What she'd actually witnessed was me talking to my cats while gardening, but Garrett had coached her to make it sound ominous. The hearing was scheduled for 3 months out, plenty of time for me to gather evidence of my own. What Garrett didn't know was that Grandma had warned me this would happen. During her final week, when the morphine made her lucid in unexpected moments, she'd gripped my hand with surprising strength. "Your uncle's a snake," she'd whispered, her voice barely audible. "He's been asking about my will for months, trying to find ways to contest it. He even brought some lawyer friend by last month, claiming it was just a social visit, but I heard them talking on the porch about undue influence and mental capacity evaluations. She'd made me promise to fight for what was rightfully mine. Don't let him win," she'd said. "That money is meant to give you freedom, not line his pockets. I've been saving it for 60 years so you could have choices I never had." I thought she was being paranoid. Turns out, even dying, Grandma was sharper than the rest of us. The day I received the incompetency petition, I sat in my kitchen reading every word. Garrett had been methodical. He documented times I'd seemed confused about dates, occasions when I'd appeared disheveled in public, instances where I'd made irrational purchases like organic cat food and art supplies. He'd even included a statement from my former law school advisor claiming I'd had an emotional breakdown during finals week. What had actually happened was that I'd cried in Professor Martinez's office after failing my corporate law exam, but Garrett had somehow tracked him down and convinced him to frame it as evidence of mental instability. That's when I realized something important. If Garrett wanted to see crazy, I'd give him a performance he'd never forget. But first, I needed to understand exactly what I was up against. I spent 3 days researching competency law, guardianship proceedings, and the specific requirements for having someone declared mentally incompetent. The more I learned, the more I realized how easily the system could be manipulated by someone with the right connections and enough malicious intent. I also started investigating Garrett himself. If he wanted to play dirty, I'd dig up every piece of dirt he'd ever buried. I started small with the performance. At family dinners, I'd stare blankly when spoken to, then suddenly laugh at nothing. I let my hair get greasy and wore the same clothes multiple days in a row. When Garrett visited to check on me, I'd leave dirty dishes everywhere and mutter about hearing voices. The neighbors are watching me, I'd whisper, peeking through curtains with exaggerated paranoia. They know about the money. They know Grandma told me secrets before she died. What secrets, honey? Garrett would ask, leaning forward with fake concern while his eyes gleamed with interest. Can't tell, I'd mutter, shaking my head rapidly. The walls have ears. Everything's recorded now. They're listening through the electrical outlets. I'd point at random spots on the wall, pretending to see cameras that weren't there. Poor Vivian, he'd tell relatives afterward with perfectly practiced sympathy. She's really deteriorating since Grandma died. The grief has just broken something in her mind. Yesterday, she spent 2 hours talking to the mailbox, convinced it was sending messages to the government. But what Garrett didn't know was that I'd installed security cameras throughout the house the day after the will reading, hidden in picture frames, smoke detectors, even inside fake books on the shelves. I documented every conversation, every manipulative comment, every moment he thought he was alone and let his mask slip. The performance became elaborate. I'd accidentally burn food, leaving smoke alarms blaring when he visited. I'd answer the door in my bathrobe at 3 p.m., claiming I'd lost track of time and thought it was morning. I started collecting newspapers obsessively, stacking them in corners while muttering about important information and patterns only I could see. I bought 27 different conspiracy theory books and left them scattered around the house with highlighted passages about government surveillance and family betrayals. I set up a bulletin board covered in red string, connecting random photos, newspaper clippings, and handwritten notes that seemed delusional, but were actually grocery lists written in code. The grocery lists were my private joke. Milk, eggs, bread, destroy Uncle Garrett looked completely insane when written in my deliberately unstable handwriting and connected to photos of politicians with red string. Garrett ate it up. He brought friends by to witness my decline, shaking his head sadly as I rambled about conspiracy theories I'd researched online. He'd whisper loudly enough for me to overhear. The doctors say it might be genetic. My mother had some paranoid episodes near the end too. That was a lie. Grandma had been sharp until her final breath, sharp enough to hide a recording device in her bedside table during Garrett's last visit. I'd found the recording after her death, where she'd caught him rifling through her jewelry box while she pretended to sleep. I escalated the performance. I started answering my phone with Vivian's House of Secrets were being monitored and hanging up on telemarketers after warning them about the listeners. I wore the same stained sweater for a week straight and shuffled around in fuzzy slippers, even when Garrett brought his lawyer by for an informal visit. How long has she been like this? The lawyer asked, watching me arrange cat toys in geometric patterns while humming off key. It started right after the funeral, Garrett said sadly. She became obsessed with the idea that people were plotting against her. Last week, she tried to pay for groceries with Monopoly money and genuinely seemed confused when the cashier explained the difference. That last part was true. I'd practiced looking genuinely bewildered when confronted with the concept of real currency versus board game money. The acting exercise had been surprisingly therapeutic, and the cashier had been so concerned she'd called the store manager to help the confused young lady. I could see the lawyer mentally calculating how easy this case would be. A clearly delusional young woman with documented erratic behavior up against a concerned family member just trying to protect her? It would be a slam dunk, if only they knew about the cameras capturing every word. During this time, I was also building my real case. I hired a private investigator named Ruby Chen, a former police detective who specialized in family financial disputes. Ruby was recommended by one of my law school professors who'd stayed in touch after I dropped out. Your uncle's got this whole thing planned out, Ruby explained during our first meeting at a coffee shop across town. I've been looking into his finances, and the man's desperate. He owes money to contractors, gambling buddies, even the IRS. Without that inheritance, he's looking at bankruptcy within 6 months. Ruby had already discovered that Garrett had been stealing from Grandma before she died. Small amounts from her checking account, jewelry pieces he claimed she'd given him, even a forged signature on a loan document 6 months before her death where he'd borrowed against her house without her knowledge. The interesting thing, Ruby continued, spreading documents across the table, is that your grandmother seems to have known about the theft. She kept detailed records of everything that went missing, complete with dates and descriptions. She even had her jewelry appraised and photographed before some of his visits. This was news to me. Grandma had been building her own case against Garrett. There's more, Ruby said. Your uncle's been telling people for years that your grandmother promised him the inheritance. I've got recorded conversations where he's bragging about how he'll be set for life once the old lady dies. He even pre-ordered a boat last month, telling the dealer he'd have the money soon. The boat was a 30-foot cabin cruiser that cost more than most people's houses. Garrett had apparently put down a $50,000 deposit and told the dealer his inheritance would come through any day now. Ruby also discovered that Garrett had approached several other family members, trying to get them to support his competency claim. He'd offered my cousin Derek $10,000 to testify that I'd seemed unstable at Christmas dinner. Derek had recorded the conversation and sent it to Ruby. Your uncle's not just greedy, Ruby explained. He's sloppy. He's leaving evidence everywhere because he's so confident this will work. The real breakthrough came when Garrett brought Dr. Morrison to examine me, a psychiatrist who apparently owed Garrett money from their weekly poker games. Ruby had discovered this connection through her police contacts. Morrison's got gambling debts up to his eyeballs, Ruby had explained. Your uncle's been floating him loans for months, and the good doctor's license is already under review for some questionable diagnostic practices in other cases. For Dr. Morrison's visit, I prepared my masterpiece performance. I spent hours researching the symptoms of various mental health conditions, not to mock them, but to create a convincing portrayal that would fool a corrupt psychiatrist who wasn't paying attention. I pretended to have a complete breakdown during the evaluation, sobbing about imaginary threats and claiming the walls were listening to our conversation. I refused to make eye contact, rocked back and forth in my chair, and insisted that my cats were the only ones I could trust because they couldn't be bought or corrupted. The government put chips in everyone's phones, I whispered, glancing around frantically. But cats don't have phones. That's why they're safe. That's why I need so many of them. They're the only witnesses I can trust. I only had 2 cats, but I'd been buying cat supplies in bulk to support my crazy cat lady image. My basement was stocked with enough cat food to supply a shelter, and I'd set up multiple litter boxes throughout the house to make it look like I was hoarding animals. Dr. Morrison barely looked up from his notepad as he scribbled his predetermined diagnosis. The whole evaluation lasted maybe 20 minutes, and he spent most of it checking his phone and making notes that had nothing to do with my behavior. Do you hear voices that other people can't hear? He asked in a bored tone. Only the cats, I replied, then started having a full conversation with my tabby, Mr. Whiskers, about the doctor's suspicious motives. You see it too, don't you? The way he's not really listening? He's already decided what to write. Morrison didn't even react to this obviously staged behavior. He just scribbled more notes and asked perfunctory questions about my sleep patterns and appetite. Severe paranoid delusions with possible schizophrenic episodes, he told Garrett afterward, thinking I was upstairs napping. She's clearly unable to distinguish reality from fantasy. The cat obsession is particularly concerning, classic sign of isolation-induced psychosis. She'll never be competent to handle that inheritance. I'll make sure the court sees that. How much will your testimony cost? Garrett asked bluntly. Consider my poker debt forgiven, and we're even, Morrison replied. Plus my usual expert witness fee, of course. Gotta make it look legitimate. They laughed like old friends sharing a joke. I recorded everything from the air vent above the kitchen, where I'd installed one of my best cameras. Meanwhile, Ruby was uncovering more evidence of Garrett's desperation and criminal behavior. We discovered he'd been living off credit for the past 5 years, using one credit card to pay another in an endless cycle that was about to collapse. Your uncle's been telling creditors that he's expecting a large inheritance, Ruby explained during one of our weekly updates. He's used that story to get extensions on loans, advance payments from contractors, even convinced his mortgage company to defer payments for 6 months. The web of lies was staggering. Garrett had promised the same inheritance money to a dozen different creditors. When the will reading revealed he wasn't getting anything, his entire financial house of cards would collapse. There's something else, Ruby said, pulling out another folder. I found evidence that your uncle tried this same scam with his grandfather 15 years ago. Different circumstances, but the same basic approach. Claim the heir is mentally incompetent, get yourself appointed guardian, control the money. The grandfather case had failed because other family members had intervened, but it showed that Garrett's current scheme wasn't a desperate last-minute idea. It was a calculated pattern. 3 weeks before the hearing, I made contact with Garrett's ex-wife, Rita. She'd been bitter about their divorce for 15 years, especially since Garrett had hidden assets during the proceedings and left her with almost nothing. He's trying to steal your inheritance? Rita laughed harshly over coffee at a diner downtown. That sounds exactly like him. The man thinks he's entitled to everything that isn't nailed down. During our marriage, he tried to convince my elderly aunt to change her will and leave him her house. When that didn't work, he actually suggested we contest it after she died. I explained my plan. Rita's eyes lit up with vindictive joy that was almost frightening. I've been waiting years to watch that man get what he deserves, she said. Count me in. I've got boxes of evidence about his financial manipulations. Rita had saved every piece of documentation from their marriage, including evidence of Garrett's previous attempts to manipulate elderly relatives. His own grandfather had changed his will 3 times after Garrett's visits, each time giving him less money as he caught on to his grandson's schemes. Garrett tried the same thing with my grandmother, Rita explained, pulling out a folder thick with documents. He'd visit her when she was sick, bringing flowers and fake sympathy, then suggest she update her will to make things easier for the family. When she refused, he started spreading rumors about her mental state, claiming she was getting confused and might be taken advantage of by unscrupulous relatives. She showed me bank records proving Garrett had forged checks from his grandfather's account, medical records that contradicted his claims about the old man's mental state, and even a confession letter he'd written during their divorce, where he admitted to various financial schemes. The best part, Rita said with a vindictive smile, is that I recorded most of our arguments during the divorce. He admitted to all kinds of stuff when he was angry, thinking I'd never use it against him. The recordings were devastating. Hours of Garrett admitting to forgery, manipulation, and outright theft from elderly relatives. In one particularly damaging conversation, he bragged about how easy it was to convince doctors to question someone's mental capacity if you presented the right evidence. 3 days before the hearing, I made my final preparation. I cleaned myself up, organized all my evidence into a presentation that would make my law school professors proud, and called the one person Garrett would never suspect, his current wife, Cheryl. "I know you think I'm crazy," I told her over the phone, letting my voice shake convincingly. "But I found something in Grandma's papers about Garrett. I'm scared to tell anyone else, but I think you should know." Cheryl arrived within an hour, looking nervous and suspicious. Over the past months, I'd noticed cracks in their marriage. Garrett's financial stress was showing, and he'd been taking it out on her with increasing frequency. I showed her fabricated documents suggesting Garrett had been planning to leave her once he got the inheritance. Bank statements showing secret accounts, printed emails about new starts and freedom from dead weight, even a fake receipt for a consultation with a divorce attorney. The documents were completely fake, created by Ruby's tech-savvy nephew. But Cheryl's reaction was real. Years of suspicion about Garrett's faithfulness came flooding out. "That bastard," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. I knew something was wrong. He's been so secretive lately, taking phone calls in the garage, staying out late for business meetings that don't exist. She told me about finding credit card bills for expensive restaurants where he'd taken clients she'd never heard of, hotel receipts for overnight trips that didn't match his supposed work schedule, and mysterious cash withdrawals from their joint account. I comforted her while secretly recording our conversation. By the time she left, Cheryl had agreed to testify about Garrett's financial desperation and his comments about doing whatever it takes to get Grandma's money. "He said your grandmother was a selfish old bat for not leaving him anything," Cheryl admitted. "He said she'd lost her mind and didn't understand what family meant. He even joked about having her declared incompetent before she died, but said it was too late because she'd already made the will. This was perfect evidence of premeditation. There's something else," Cheryl continued, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Last week, he brought home some medical forms and asked me to sign them as a witness. He said they were just routine paperwork, but when I looked closer, they were requests for your medical records from various doctors. He forged your signature on the authorization forms. This was a federal crime. Garrett had committed medical privacy violations to build his case against me. The morning of the court date, I walked into that courtroom looking like a completely different person, clean, composed, wearing a sharp business suit I'd hidden in my closet for months. My hair was professionally styled, my makeup perfect. I looked every inch the competent law school graduate I actually was. Garrett's face went white when he saw me. He leaned over to whisper frantically to his lawyer, who looked equally confused. "What happened to her?" I heard him hiss. "She was completely out of it yesterday." His lawyer, a sleazy-looking man named Patterson who specialized in questionable guardianship cases, tried to recover quickly. "Sometimes people with mental illness can have moments of clarity," he whispered back. "It doesn't change the underlying pathology." But I could see the doubt creeping into his eyes. The hearing began with Patterson presenting Garrett's case. He called several witnesses who testified to my supposed erratic behavior over the past months. Mrs. Henderson from next door repeated her story about the animated conversations with invisible people. Dr. Morrison gave his rehearsed testimony about paranoid delusions and cognitive decline. "The subject exhibits classic signs of paranoid schizophrenia," Morrison told the judge confidently. "She's unable to distinguish reality from fantasy and poses a danger to herself if left unsupervised. Her obsession with cats is particularly concerning, as is her belief that she's being monitored by government agencies." He presented his notes from our session, complete with fabricated quotes and exaggerated symptoms. "In my professional opinion," Morrison concluded, "Ms. Walsh is wholly incompetent to manage her own affairs, let alone a significant inheritance. She requires immediate guardianship and potentially long-term institutional care." The judge, an elderly man named Harrison, who'd been on the bench for 30 years, listened carefully to each witness. I could see him taking notes, occasionally glancing at me with what looked like concern. Then it was my turn. I stood up, walked to the judge's bench with perfect posture, and handed over a flash drive containing everything I'd gathered. "Your Honor, I'd like to present evidence that this entire petition is fraudulent." The courtroom erupted. Garrett jumped to his feet, but his lawyer pulled him back down with a sharp yank. "Objection!" Patterson shouted. "This is highly irregular!" "Overruled," Judge Harrison said calmly. "I'm curious to hear what the respondent has to say. Please proceed, Ms. Walsh." I had prepared a presentation that laid out Garrett's scheme methodically. First, I played the recording of Garrett and Dr. Morrison's deal. The judge's expression darkened as he heard them discussing falsified testimony and debt forgiveness. "This is fabricated," Garrett shouted. "She's making this up." "Mr. Walsh," the judge said coldly, "you'll have your chance to respond. Sit down." Next came the financial records showing Garrett's desperation and theft from Grandma's accounts. Ruby had done beautiful work documenting every fraudulent transaction, every forged signature, every lie he'd told to cover his tracks. I showed evidence of the boat deposit, the promises to creditors, the hidden credit card debt, even his attempts to manipulate other family members into supporting his case. Your Honor, I said, my uncle isn't trying to protect me from financial mismanagement. He's trying to steal my inheritance to pay off his own debts and fund a lifestyle he can't afford. Then I called my witnesses. Ruby took the stand first, presenting her investigation findings with the precision of a seasoned detective. She walked the judge through Garrett's financial history, his pattern of manipulation, and the evidence of his theft from Grandma's accounts. In my professional opinion, Ruby testified, Mr. Walsh orchestrated this entire competency proceeding as a way to gain control of assets that don't belong to him. His financial desperation provides clear motive, and his history shows a pattern of attempting to manipulate elderly relatives for financial gain. Then Rita took the stand. Your Honor, she said, her voice steady with years of suppressed rage, my ex-husband has a pattern of manipulating elderly relatives for financial gain. I have documentation going back 20 years. She presented the evidence methodically. The forged checks from his grandfather, the manipulated will changes, the recorded conversations where Garrett admitted to his schemes. She played excerpts from their divorce arguments where Garrett bragged about his manipulation tactics. He told me once that elderly people were easy marks because they were lonely and wanted to believe family members cared about them, Rita testified. He said all you had to do was visit regularly, bring gifts, and then start suggesting changes to their financial arrangements for their own good. But the final blow was Cheryl. Your Honor, she said, her voice shaking with rage and betrayal. My husband told me exactly what he planned to do. He said, that little bitch doesn't deserve Grandma's money. I'll have her locked up in a mental hospital if I have to. Once she's declared incompetent, I'll be appointed guardian and the money will be as good as mine. She testified about the forged medical record requests, the secret debts, and Garrett's increasingly desperate behavior as his financial situation deteriorated. He's been lying to everyone, Cheryl continued. He told me we were financially secure, but I found out last week that he's been using our joint credit cards to make minimum payments on debts I didn't even know existed. We're facing foreclosure, and he saw Vivian's inheritance as his only way out. Garrett stood up, screaming, she's lying, you're all lying, this is a conspiracy. The judge banged his gavel hard. Mr. Walsh, sit down immediately or I'll hold you in contempt. But Garrett was beyond reason. 20 years of careful planning crumbled in 20 minutes. He lunged toward me, yelling about how I'd stolen his inheritance, how Grandma had been poisoned against him, how I was too stupid and crazy to handle real money. I worked for this, he screamed as court security moved toward him. I visited that old bat every week, listened to her boring stories, pretended to care about her stupid cats. That money should be mine. His mask had completely slipped. The caring, concerned uncle was gone, replaced by the true Garrett, greedy, entitled, and vicious. Court security restrained him as he continued his rant, proving more effectively than any testimony that he was the unstable one. She's not even family, Garrett shrieked as they dragged him toward the door. She's just some brat my mother favored because she felt guilty about how my father treated me. I'm her real son. I deserve everything she had. The judge dismissed the petition immediately and ordered an investigation into Dr. Morrison's medical license. He also referred Garrett's theft charges to the district attorney. Mr. Walsh, the judge said as they prepared to lead him away, I've seen many frivolous lawsuits in my courtroom, but this level of fraud and manipulation is particularly disturbing. You attempted to have your own niece committed to a mental institution for financial gain. That's not just illegal, it's unconscionable. As they led Garrett away in handcuffs, he looked back at me with pure hatred. You think you've won? He snarled. This isn't over. Family doesn't forget Vivian. You'll get what's coming to you. But it was over. 3 months later, Garrett was convicted of elder abuse, fraud, attempted manipulation of court proceedings, and medical privacy violations. He got 5 years in state prison. Dr. Morrison lost his license and faced perjury charges. His gambling debts were exposed, and several other suspicious cases he'd been involved in were reopened for investigation. Cheryl divorced Garrett immediately and took half of what little he had left, which wasn't much after his legal fees and restitution payments. She also testified against him in the criminal trial, providing additional evidence of his schemes and manipulations. I inherited Grandma's estate on my 25th birthday, exactly as she intended. The first thing I did was establish a foundation to help elderly people protect themselves from financial abuse by family members. Ruby became the foundation's head investigator, and we've helped dozens of families avoid situations like mine. The second thing I did was change the locks on every property and install a state-of-the-art security system. The cameras I'd used to catch Garrett were replaced with professional-grade equipment, because I'd learned that predators rarely work alone. I also went back to law school, using some of the inheritance to pay for my education. My experience with Garrett had taught me more about the legal system than any textbook could, and I wanted to use that knowledge to help others. Because I learned something important during those 3 months of pretending to be crazy. The line between acting unstable and actually becoming unstable is thinner than you think. Some nights, alone in that big house with all my fake symptoms, I almost forgot I was performing. The isolation, the constant vigilance, the paranoia, even when it's manufactured, takes a toll. I started seeing a real therapist, Dr. Williams, who helped me process the trauma of growing up with a predatory family member and the stress of the legal battle. She helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't just financial abuse, it was psychological warfare. Your uncle didn't just want your money, Dr. Williams explained during one of our sessions. He wanted to break you psychologically, making you doubt your own sanity, isolating you from support systems, convincing others that you were unstable. These are classic tactics of psychological abuse. But I also learned that sometimes the best way to expose someone's true nature is to give them exactly what they think they want. Garrett thought he wanted a crazy, incompetent niece he could manipulate. Instead, he got a law school dropout who'd learned more about legal strategy in 3 months than he'd absorbed in 60 years of scheming. The foundation has helped 43 families so far, and we're expanding our services every year. Each case reminds me why Grandma's final gift wasn't just money. It was the chance to protect others from predators like Garrett. We've caught embezzling caregivers, manipulative stepchildren, and corrupt lawyers who prey on elderly clients. We've helped families recognize the warning signs of financial abuse and take action before it's too late. The house is peaceful now. My cats, both of them, spend their days sunbathing in Grandma's garden, where she taught me to recognize the difference between flowers and weeds. And every evening, I sit on the porch where she used to rock, watching the sunset over the lake that Garrett will never see again as a free man. Last month, I got another letter from Garrett in prison. This was his 4th attempt to contact me since his conviction. He wanted to apologize, to make amends, to be family again. He claimed he'd found God and realized the error of his ways. I threw it away without reading past the first line, just like I had with the others. Some people don't deserve second chances, especially when they never deserved the first one. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's getting everything they thought they could take from you, then using it to make sure they can never hurt anyone else the same way. The foundation has helped 43 families so far. Each case reminds me why Grandma's final gift wasn't just money. It was the chance to protect others from predators like Garrett. And every time we catch another financial manipulator, every time we save someone's inheritance from a greedy relative, I can almost hear Grandma's voice. That's my girl. Now you're using that brain for something worthwhile. Last week, we had our biggest victory yet. A case involving a 90-year-old woman whose son had been systematically draining her accounts for years. We caught him trying to have her declared incompetent so he could sell her house and move her into a nursing home where she'd have no oversight of her finances. The son's scheme was almost identical to Garrett's, down to the corrupt doctor willing to provide false testimony. But this time, we were ready for him. Ruby had trained our team to recognize the patterns, document the evidence, and build airtight cases that courts couldn't ignore. We saved that woman's house, her independence, and over $800,000 that her son had planned to steal. After the hearing, the woman hugged me with tears in her eyes. "Thank you for believing me," she whispered. "No one else would listen." That's when I knew Grandma would be proud. Her money wasn't just securing my future. It was protecting families from the kind of predator who had tried to destroy us both. The irony isn't lost on me. Garrett spent years trying to convince people I was mentally incompetent, but his actions proved he was the one who couldn't distinguish right from wrong, reality from fantasy, or love from greed. Now, 3 years later, I'm a practicing attorney specializing in elder law and family financial abuse. I have a successful practice, a beautiful home, and the satisfaction of knowing that Garrett's scheme not only failed, it led to a career that's the exact opposite of everything he represents. Sometimes the best revenge isn't getting even. It's getting everything they thought they could take from you, then using it to make the world a little bit safer from people like them.